She died in a bus accident 19 years ago. Or at least, that's what he thought. Until, in a restaurant, he finds her alive. What happened? How did she survive? Get ready to uncover a mystery that will turn everything upside down. The rain fell steadily over New York, a city cloaked in the lingering shadows of a tragedy 19 years past. Samuel Carter stared out from the penthouse window of his Manhattan high-rise, watching as the droplets raced down the glass, their erratic paths mimicking the chaos he felt within. The room behind him was a testament to his empire. Sleek furniture, original artwork, and the faint hum of technology that never truly rested. Yet, Samuel felt none of the satisfaction such wealth was supposed to bring. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly against his glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling like his thoughts. Below, the city thrummed with life. Taxis honked, pedestrians scurried, and neon signs reflected off puddles in the streets. This was a world Samuel had conquered, bending it to his will, but now it seemed foreign, hollow. A whisper of nostalgia tugged at him, memories of simpler days, before boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. He longed for a connection, something real amid the manufactured perfection of his life. The decision came suddenly, born of an impulse he could neither name nor suppress. Samuel grabbed his coat and stepped into the elevator, descending into the depths of a city that had always seemed to mirror his ambition. As the car descended, the weight of his life seemed to lift, replaced by a strange sense of freedom. He instructed his driver to take him anywhere, somewhere far removed from the polished veneer of his usual haunts. The man hesitated but obeyed, weaving through the labyrinthine streets until they reached the fringes of the city. Samuel stepped out into an unfamiliar neighborhood, his polished shoes meeting cracked pavement. The air smelled of fried food and damp concrete, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury he had grown accustomed to. A modest, weather-worn sign caught his eye. Delilah's Diner. It was a place he would have once passed without a second glance, but tonight it called to him. Inside, the diner was a mosaic of the mundane. Faded red booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years, and the hum of fluorescent lights. Samuel slid into a corner booth, feeling out of place but oddly at ease. He ordered a black coffee and a slice of pie, the simplicity of the menu a balm to his complicated existence. For a moment, he let himself be a man, not a mogul, savoring the quiet. The door jingled as another customer entered, but Samuel barely noticed. His attention was on the waitress approaching his table. She was ordinary in a way that felt extraordinary to him, a sharp contrast to the polished, airbrushed faces he usually encountered. Her voice was soft yet firm as she asked if he needed anything else. Samuel looked up to reply, and time seemed to freeze. Her face was achingly familiar, stirring a memory buried under years of grief. Lauren. The name formed in his mind before he could stop it. It couldn't be her. She had died. He had mourned her, built a life atop the ruins of their shared dreams. But the resemblance was undeniable. His heart pounded in his chest as he searched her eyes for a glimmer of recognition. There was none. She looked at him quizzically, as if sensing his unease. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Samuel stammered a response, his composure unraveling. The moment passed, and she turned to leave, but Samuel couldn't let it go. He had to know if this was some cruel trick of fate or a miracle he didn't dare hope for. As she walked away, Samuel felt a surge of determination. His life had been built on control, on shaping the world to his will. Yet here was something he couldn't explain, couldn't ignore. The questions swirled in his mind, each one more urgent than the last. Who was this woman? And if she wasn't Lauren, why did she carry her face? Samuel leaned back in his seat, the coffee forgotten. For the first time in years, he felt alive, driven not by ambition but by the tantalizing possibility of answers. The city outside continued its relentless pace, but for Samuel, everything had changed. The world he had built was crumbling, and he couldn't help but wonder if that was exactly what he needed. The diner faded into the background as Samuel replayed the moment over and over in his mind. Her face. It wasn't possible, yet he couldn't deny the truth his eyes had seen. The woman who had served him coffee was the ghost he had carried for 19 years. Lauren Whitman, the love he had lost in the crash that had shattered his world. But she was alive, or someone who looked so much like her that the difference was meaningless. He had first met Lauren in college, both of them young and full of dreams. She had been a firecracker, all laughter and ambition, drawing him out of his shell and showing him the beauty in life's imperfections. Her father, Thomas Whitman, had been an imposing figure even then, a man of wealth and power, with an air of menace that had always unsettled Samuel. He had never understood what Lauren saw in him, but her love had been fierce and unyielding, a force that seemed invincible. Then came the accident. A bus crash, they'd said. The wreckage had been catastrophic, the flames consuming everything. Samuel had been devastated, drowning himself in his work to escape the void she left behind. He had risen to the top, but the price was his soul. Now, as he sat in the diner, those years of grief seemed to mock him. Had it all been a lie? Or worse, had he failed her in some unfathomable way? Samuel couldn't leave it unanswered. He watched the waitress from a distance, careful not to draw attention. Her movements were deliberate but unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. There was something familiar in her gestures, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear or glanced at the clock when she thought no one was looking. It wasn't just her face, her essence was the same. But why didn't she recognize him? He lingered longer than he intended, the diner emptying out as the night deepened. Eventually, she approached his table again, her expression weary but polite. "We're closing soon," she said, her tone tinged with exhaustion. Samuel cleared his throat, his words coming out awkwardly. I'm sorry. You remind me of someone I used to know." She tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "I get that sometimes," she replied with a small, apologetic smile. "I must have one of those faces." "No," Samuel said, more forcefully than he intended. "It's not just your face. It's everything." He paused, struggling to articulate the turmoil inside him. "Do you know someone named Samuel Carter?" The name hung in the air like a fragile thread, ready to snap. She hesitated, a flicker of something, confusion, recognition, fear, crossing her features. "No," she said after a moment, her voice steady but distant. "I don't think so." Samuel's heart sank. He wanted to believe her, but his instincts told him there was more to this than coincidence. She excused herself, retreating to the counter to begin closing up. He sat there, paralyzed by indecision, until the clang of the door jolted him. A man had entered, his weathered face familiar. Samuel froze as the pieces fell into place. It was one of Thomas Whitman's men. He was older now, his hair gray and his gait slower, but Samuel would never forget the man who had stood by Lauren's father all those years ago. What was he doing here? The man exchanged a curt nod with the waitress, his expression unreadable. Samuel felt the room shrink around him, his pulse quickening. The answers he sought were closer than he'd imagined, but so were the dangers. Samuel rose to leave, his mind racing. He needed time to think, to plan. As he stepped into the cold night air, the city seemed different, its lights harsher and its shadows deeper. He didn't know what game he was stepping into, but one thing was clear. Lauren's disappearance wasn't the tragedy he had believed it to be. It was a puzzle, one he was determined to solve. Walking away from the diner, Samuel felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. He had spent years building walls around his pain, but they were crumbling now, leaving him exposed. The memories of Lauren, of their love, of the life they had dreamed of together, surged back with a vengeance. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. The city whispered secrets to him as he made his way back to his car, its streets alive with the echoes of lives interwoven with his own. Somewhere in this sprawling maze lay the truth, hidden but not unreachable. Samuel clenched his fists, a resolve hardening within him. If Lauren was alive, he would find out why she had been taken from him, and why she didn't remember him. The following morning, Samuel Carter awoke with the city already buzzing outside his penthouse. But the usual sounds, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter, the occasional siren, felt muted, his mind consumed by the events of the previous night. He couldn't shake the image of her face, the ghost of a love he had never truly laid to rest. Lauren, or whoever she was, had upended his carefully constructed world in an instant, and the presence of Thomas Whitman's man at the diner only deepened the mystery. Samuel had always been a man of action, a strategist who thrived on control. But this situation was unlike any corporate merger or hostile takeover he had navigated. This was personal, a storm of emotions he hadn't faced in years. He stared at his phone, his contacts filled with powerful names and resources, but he hesitated. Who could he trust with something so fragile, so deeply entwined with his past? He finally dialed a number. The call connected, and a gruff voice answered. "Elliott Investigations." "Elliott, it's Samuel Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I need you to look into someone for me." Discreetly. Elliott, a private investigator who had worked with Samuel on more than one occasion, didn't ask questions. "Send me what you have, and I'll get started," he replied. Samuel sent a brief description of Lauren and the location of the diner, along with a request to dig into any recent activity connected to Thomas Whitman. He ended the call, feeling a flicker of hope. If anyone could unravel this mystery, it was Elliott. Hours passed, the monotony of his daily routine offering no distraction. Meetings blurred together, his mind elsewhere. By late afternoon, he found himself back in his car, driving toward the diner without fully understanding why. The neighborhood felt different in the daylight, less ominous, more alive, but Samuel's unease lingered. He parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, blending in with the pedestrians. As he approached the diner, he saw her through the window, her hair catching the sunlight as she moved between tables. She looked so natural, so ordinary, and yet Samuel couldn't reconcile her presence with the woman he had lost. He hesitated before stepping inside, unsure of what he hoped to achieve. Lauren, or the woman who looked like her, noticed him immediately. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition. She approached his table cautiously, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Back so soon?" she asked, her tone light but guarded. Samuel managed to smile. "The coffee was good," he said, though the words felt hollow. "And I didn't get your name last night." She hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. "Emily," she said finally. "Emily Foster." Emily. The name felt wrong, a misfit for the woman he knew, or thought he knew. He nodded, masking his disappointment. "Nice to meet you, Emily." "I'm Samuel." Her gaze lingered on him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You look familiar," she said, almost to herself. "Have we met before?" His heart leapt at the possibility, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Maybe in another life," he said, his voice tinged with irony. "Do you mind if I ask how long you've worked here?" "About 2 years," she replied, her tone neutral. "Why?" "Just curious," he said quickly, not wanting to scare her off. "This place has a certain charm." Their conversation was interrupted by another customer calling for her attention. She excused herself, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts. He watched her move about the diner, her interactions with others unremarkable yet captivating to him. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This was Lauren. As the hours passed, Samuel pieced together small details, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the one he had loved. She seemed content, but there was an air of restraint about her, as if she were holding back a part of herself. Could it be that she didn't remember him? Or worse, that she had chosen to leave her old life behind? Samuel's contemplation was shattered when the door opened, and a familiar figure entered. It was the same man from the night before, Thomas Whitman's associate. He exchanged a brief glance with Emily before taking a seat at the counter. Samuel's instincts flared. This wasn't a coincidence. He needed to act. He rose and approached the man, his presence commanding as ever. "Mind if I join you?" Samuel asked, his tone leaving little room for refusal. The man looked up, startled but composed. "I don't think we've met," he said, his voice cool. "We haven't," Samuel replied, "but I know who you are. And I know who you work for." The man's expression hardened. "I think you're mistaken." Samuel leaned in, lowering his voice. Thomas Whitman doesn't make mistakes. So why don't you tell me why you're here? The man stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You've got the wrong idea, he said, his tone sharp. He glanced toward Emily, who was watching the exchange with growing concern. Without another word, he left the diner, his departure as abrupt as his arrival. Samuel returned to his seat, his mind racing. Emily approached him cautiously, her expression troubled. What was that about? She asked. Samuel hesitated, then looked her in the eye. I think you're in danger, he said, the weight of his words sinking between them. For a moment, the mask of indifference she wore seemed to crack, and Samuel caught a glimpse of the vulnerability beneath. Her response was barely above a whisper. Who are you? Really? The question hung in the air, marking the first crack in the mystery that bound them together. The diner was quiet now, the usual clatter of dishes and soft murmurs fading as Samuel and Emily sat across from each other. Her question lingered between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Samuel hesitated, his mind racing to find the right words. She was looking at him now, not with fear but with a cautious curiosity, as though she was searching for something familiar in his face. My name is Samuel Carter, he said finally, his voice steady. 19 years ago, I lost someone I loved in a tragedy, a bus crash. Her name was Lauren Whitman. You remind me of her. Emily's expression flickered, a mix of confusion and disbelief. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I've never heard of Lauren Whitman. Samuel leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. I know this sounds insane, but you look exactly like her. Not just a resemblance. Everything about you feels the same. And then there's that man who keeps coming here. He works for Thomas Whitman, Lauren's father. Emily's breath hitched, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. I don't know who that is either, she said quickly, too quickly. I've lived here for as long as I can remember. I'm just a waitress. Samuel studied her closely, noting the tension in her posture, the way her eyes darted to the side as though she were trying to escape the conversation. There was more to her story. He could feel it. But if she truly didn't remember, then the answers wouldn't come easily. Emily, he said softly, his voice taking on a gentler tone. If there's even the slightest chance you're Lauren, I need to know. I've spent almost 2 decades believing you were gone. Please let me help you. She opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by the sound of her manager calling out from the kitchen. Emily, we're closing up. You okay out there? She nodded quickly, her demeanor shifting. I have to go, she said, avoiding his gaze. This is too much. Before Samuel could stop her, she stood and retreated to the back of the diner, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He wanted to follow her, to press her for more, but something held him back. If he pushed too hard, he might lose the fragile connection they had just begun to form. As he left the diner, Samuel noticed a shadow lingering near the edge of the building. The man from earlier was still watching, his figure half hidden in the dim glow of a street lamp. Samuel's frustration boiled over. He approached the man with deliberate steps, his voice low and sharp. You're not very subtle. The man didn't flinch. Stay out of this, Carter, he said, his tone cold. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Samuel's jaw tightened. Then enlighten me. Who is she? Why is Thomas Whitman interested in her? The man's expression darkened, but he said nothing more, retreating into the shadows. Samuel watched him disappear into the night, the encounter leaving him with more questions than answers. One thing was clear. The threads of this mystery were deeply entangled with Thomas Whitman's influence, and unraveling them would require a level of risk Samuel hadn't faced in years. The following morning, Samuel received a call from Elliot. I've got something for you, the investigator said, his voice clipped. The woman you're looking into, Emily Foster, has no records prior to 7 years ago. No birth certificate, no tax records, nothing. It's like she didn't exist before that. Samuel felt a chill run through him. What about Thomas Whitman? He asked. Plenty there, Elliot replied. He's been keeping a low profile for years, but there are whispers about him being involved in some shady dealings. If he's connected to this Emily, you're looking at a very messy situation. Keep digging, Samuel said, his voice firm. "I need to know everything." The call ended, leaving Samuel more determined than ever. He spent the day poring over old photographs and documents from his past, searching for anything that might connect Lauren to the present. The memories were painful, but they fueled his resolve. If Emily truly was Lauren, then her amnesia, or whatever had erased her past, was no accident. Someone had orchestrated this, and Samuel was determined to find out why. That evening, he returned to the diner, his presence an anchor in the sea of uncertainty. Emily noticed him immediately, her expression a mix of annoyance and something softer, an unspoken curiosity. She approached cautiously, her arms crossed. "You're persistent. I'll give you that," she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. "I don't give up easily," Samuel replied, his tone unwavering. "Look, I'm not here to make your life difficult, but I need to know the truth." Emily hesitated, her defenses wavering. "What if I'm not who you think I am? What if this is just a coincidence?" Samuel's eyes softened. "Then I'll walk away. But if there's even a chance, don't you want to know the truth too?" Her resolve cracked, and for the first time, she looked genuinely vulnerable. "I don't remember much about my life before I came here," she admitted quietly. "Just flashes, images, feelings. It's like looking at someone else's memories." Samuel's heart raced. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. "Let me help you," he said earnestly. "We can figure this out together." Emily's gaze held his, the weight of her uncertainty palpable. Finally, she nodded, a small gesture that carried the promise of answers. But as the two of them sat in the quiet corner of the diner, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The walls of secrecy around Emily were starting to crack, but the danger lurking in the shadows was only beginning to show itself. The days following their fragile truce were a whirlwind for Samuel and Emily. Each meeting, cloaked in secrecy, brought fragments of answers and fresh questions. Samuel, true to his word, began piecing together the puzzle, sharing old photographs and documents from his life with Lauren. Emily, hesitant but willing, began to open up about the gaps in her memory, recounting hazy images of places she couldn't name and faces she couldn't recognize. It was a tentative alliance, fraught with unspoken fears and mounting tension. One evening, Samuel arranged to meet Emily at a small cafe far from the diner, a neutral ground where they could speak without fear of interruption. She arrived wearing a simple coat, her expression guarded but curious. Samuel greeted her with a smile that he hoped would ease her nerves. "I found something," he said, sliding a photograph across the table. It was an old picture of Lauren, standing in a sunlit park, her face alight with joy. Emily stared at it, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the edges of the image. "This doesn't feel real," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's like I know her, but I don't." Samuel leaned forward, his gaze intent. "What about the man from the diner? Does he seem familiar to you?" Emily shook her head. "No, but when I see him, I feel afraid. Like he's someone I should avoid." "That fear isn't misplaced," Samuel said grimly. "He's connected to Thomas Whitman, Lauren's father. And if Whitman is involved, we're dealing with more than just a missing memory. There's a reason he's keeping tabs on you." Emily's face paled, her eyes darting around the cafe, as though expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. "Why would someone like that care about me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I'm nobody." Samuel reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "You're not nobody," he said firmly. "And if you're Lauren, then this is about more than just your disappearance. There's something they don't want us to find out." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Samuel glanced through the window to see a man pacing near the entrance, his phone pressed to his ear. Something about his stance set Samuel on edge. He turned back to Emily, his voice urgent. "We need to leave. Now." They slipped out through the back of the cafe, blending into the crowd on the street. Samuel led Emily to his car, his mind racing. As they drove, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The city's familiar streets now charged with an undercurrent of danger. Back at his penthouse, Samuel handed Emily a glass of water, his movements deliberate and calm despite the turmoil inside him. "You can stay here tonight," he said. It's safer than going back to the diner. Emily hesitated, her eyes scanning the opulent surroundings. I don't belong in a place like this, she said softly. Samuel's expression softened. You belong wherever you feel safe. That's all that matters. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to relax, sinking into the plush armchair by the window. The view of the city stretched out before her, its lights twinkling like distant stars. It's beautiful, she said, her voice tinged with wonder. It's just a facade, Samuel replied, his tone bitter. All the wealth, the power. It doesn't mean anything if you're alone. Emily looked at him, her gaze searching. Why do you care so much about me? Even if I were Lauren, why not just let the past stay buried? Samuel hesitated, the words caught in his throat. Finally, he said, because you were my everything. Losing you was like losing a part of myself. And if there's even a chance that you're still here, I can't walk away. Emily's eyes glistened, but she turned away, staring out at the city. I want to believe you, she said. I really do. But I don't know who I am anymore. As the night deepened, the air between them grew heavy with unspoken thoughts. Emily eventually drifted off to sleep, her head resting against the armrest. Samuel watched her for a moment, his heart aching with a mixture of hope and despair. He knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but he couldn't turn back now. The next morning, a call from Elliot shattered the fragile peace. I've got a lead, the investigator said. There's a facility upstate, a private clinic that specializes in memory therapy. It's connected to one of Whitman's shell companies. I think it's where your answers are. Samuel relayed the information to Emily, who listened with a mixture of dread and determination. If this place has something to do with me, she said, I need to know. Samuel nodded. We'll go together. As they prepared to leave, Samuel couldn't ignore the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The clinic might hold the key to Emily's past, but it was also a doorway into the heart of a conspiracy that Thomas Whitman had spent years burying. Samuel glanced at Emily, her expression resolute despite the fear in her eyes. Together, they were stepping into the unknown, bound by a fragile trust and the hope of uncovering the truth. The drive to the clinic was marked by a tense silence, the weight of unspoken fears filling the space between Samuel and Emily. The private facility, nestled deep in the woods upstate, was a stark contrast to the urban chaos of New York. Its facade was sleek and modern, but there was an undeniable aura of secrecy about it. Samuel parked the car a short distance away, his instincts warning him to remain cautious. This is the place? Emily asked, her voice wavering as she stared at the looming building. Samuel nodded, his jaw tightening. According to Elliot, yes. But we need to be careful. If this place is tied to Whitman, they won't welcome us with open arms. Emily hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of her coat. What if I don't like what we find? Samuel glanced at her, his expression softening. The truth isn't always easy, but it's better than living in the dark. Whatever we uncover, we'll face it together. They approached the clinic cautiously, slipping past the perimeter unnoticed. Samuel had bribed a security guard earlier for access to the building's blueprints, and they followed the least monitored route to the back entrance. Inside, the sterile hallways were eerily quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. They moved quickly, Samuel's determination driving him forward. Emily, though visibly nervous, kept pace, her eyes darting to every shadow. As they rounded a corner, they found a locked door labeled patient records. Samuel produced a set of tools from his coat and began picking the lock, his movements practiced and precise. The door clicked open, revealing rows of filing cabinets and a central computer terminal. Emily stood watch while Samuel rifled through the files, his breath hitching when he found a folder labeled Foster, Emily. He handed it to her, his hands trembling slightly. Open it, he said. Emily hesitated, then flipped through the pages. Her face paled as she scanned the documents, medical reports, psychological evaluations, and a series of photos that made her gasp. One of them was unmistakably her, though younger and with a haunted look in her eyes. What is this? She whispered, her voice shaking. Samuel leaned over her shoulder, his own shock mirroring hers. The documents painted a disturbing picture. Emily, if that was even her real name, had been admitted to the clinic 7 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Her record showed extensive memory therapy, including experimental treatments that had effectively erased her past. This wasn't an accident, Samuel said, his voice tight with anger. They didn't just find you, they took you. They wiped your memories and gave you a new identity. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the folder. Why? Why would someone do this to me? Before Samuel could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. He grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward the back of the room. They hid behind a row of cabinets as 2 men entered, both dressed in security uniforms. One of them checked the room, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. They're looking for us, Samuel whispered. We need to move. They waited until the guards left, then slipped out and made their way deeper into the facility. Samuel's gut told him there was more to uncover, and he wasn't leaving until he found it. They reached another door, this one marked Research Wing. Samuel picked the lock again, and they stepped into a room filled with monitors and equipment. The centerpiece of the room was a wall of screens displaying patient footage. Samuel's breath caught as he saw a familiar face on one of them. Emily, strapped to a chair, her expression vacant as a doctor spoke to her. Emily stared at the screen, her hand flying to her mouth. That's me, she said, her voice cracking. What are they doing to me? Samuel studied the footage, his anger simmering beneath the surface. It looks like they were implanting new memories, or suppressing old ones. Whoever orchestrated this went to great lengths to erase who you were. As they sifted through the data, they found references to a project labeled Oblivion. The files were encrypted, but the snippets they could read hinted at a conspiracy larger than they had imagined. The name Thomas Whitman appeared multiple times, along with coded entries suggesting funding and directives tied to Emily's case. This isn't just about you, Samuel said grimly. This is part of something bigger. Something Whitman didn't want anyone to find. Their discovery was interrupted by the sound of an alarm blaring through the facility. Red lights flashed, and a voice over the intercom announced a security breach. Samuel grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the exit. Run, he said. They sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing against the sterile walls. Guards appeared from every corner, their shouts growing louder. Samuel fought to keep Emily close, his mind racing for a way out. He spotted a service elevator and pushed her inside just as the guards closed in. The doors slid shut, and they descended into silence. Emily leaned against the wall, her chest heaving. What now? She asked, her voice laced with panic. Samuel checked the files he had grabbed before they fled. We take this to Elliot. He can help us decode it. The elevator stopped, and they slipped out into the parking garage. Samuel's car was still parked in the shadows, and they climbed in, speeding away before the guards could catch up. The documents sat between them, a fragile link to the truth they sought. As they drove back to the city, Emily stared out the window, her mind racing. If what we found is true, she said softly, then I'm not Emily Foster. But I don't know who Lauren Whitman is either. Samuel glanced at her, his expression resolute. We'll figure it out. Whatever it takes, we'll find the truth. In the rearview mirror, Samuel spotted a black SUV following at a distance. The danger was far from over, but they had taken the first step toward unraveling the web of lies. For the first time in years, Samuel felt a flicker of hope, faint but undeniable. The answers were out there, and together, they would uncover them. The black SUV in the rearview mirror cast a long shadow over their flight from the clinic. Samuel tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind racing as he navigated through the dimly lit streets. Emily sat silently beside him, her face pale and drawn, clutching the stolen documents as though they were a lifeline. They're following us, Samuel said, his voice low but steady. We need to lose them before we can figure out our next move. Emily nodded, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her seat. The streets blurred into a labyrinth of possibilities, and Samuel's instincts, honed from years of navigating cutthroat business dealings, guided him. He made a series of abrupt turns, weaving through side streets and alleys, until the SUV was a distant speck in the night. Finally, He pulled into the underground parking lot of an unassuming apartment building. "We'll be safe here for a while," Samuel said, stepping out of the car. Emily followed, clutching the folder tightly. The two made their way to a small unit on the building's top floor, a safe house Samuel had maintained for years, a relic of his more reckless days. The room was sparse but secure, its single window overlooking the city's glowing skyline. Samuel locked the door behind them, his shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time that night. Emily sank onto the worn sofa, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and unease. "This doesn't feel real," she murmured, staring at the documents in her hands. "How could they do this to me? To my life?" Samuel sat beside her, his tone calm but resolute. "This wasn't random, Emily. They didn't erase your identity by chance. Whitman had a reason. We just need to figure out what it is." She looked at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "What if I don't like what we find?" Samuel hesitated, then placed a hand on hers. "Whatever it is, you're not alone in this. We'll face it together." The tension was interrupted by the ringing of Samuel's phone. He answered quickly, recognizing Elliot's number. "Tell me you've got something," he said. "I do," Elliot replied, his voice clipped. "Those files you sent over from the clinic, this project, Oblivion, wasn't just about erasing memories. It was about creating new ones, implanting false identities. Whoever this woman is, Whitman didn't just hide her. He rebuilt her." Samuel glanced at Emily, who was listening intently. "Why go to such lengths?" he asked. "That's the real question," Elliot said. "But here's the kicker. There's a reference in these files to a phase 2. I don't know what it means yet, but it's clear they weren't done with her." Samuel felt a chill run through him. "Keep digging. Let me know the moment you find anything else." As the call ended, Emily spoke, her voice trembling. "Phase 2? What does that mean? Are they going to come after me again?" Samuel's expression hardened. "Not if I can help it, but we need to stay ahead of them. The more we know, the better we can protect ourselves." The rest of the night passed in a haze of planning and deciphering the stolen documents. They discovered mentions of financial transactions tied to offshore accounts, as well as connections to shell companies under Whitman's control. The deeper they delved, the more tangled the web became. By morning, the safe house felt like a cocoon of tension. Emily paced the room while Samuel worked tirelessly, cross-referencing the clinic's files with old data he had on Thomas Whitman. The name of one account in particular caught his eye, Ryan Foundation. "Ryan," Samuel muttered under his breath. The name felt significant, though he couldn't place why. Emily looked up. "What is it?" Samuel hesitated. "There's a reference to something called the Ryan Foundation. It might be connected to all of this. Do you remember anyone named Ryan?" Emily shook her head, frustration flashing across her face. "No, I don't remember anything before the last 7 years." The moment was broken by a sudden, sharp knock at the door. Samuel motioned for Emily to stay quiet, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he kept hidden in the safe house. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Who is it?" Samuel called out, his voice firm. "It's me," came Elliot's gruff voice from the other side. Samuel relaxed slightly and opened the door to let the investigator in. Elliot stepped inside, his face grim. He carried a briefcase filled with printed documents and a laptop. "You're not going to like this," Elliot said, setting the briefcase down on the table. "I've traced some of the funding behind the Ryan Foundation. It ties back to Thomas Whitman, but it also connects to an orphanage in upstate New York." "An orphanage?" Samuel asked, his brow furrowing. Elliot nodded. "And here's where it gets strange. There are records of a child being placed there around the same time Emily's records at the clinic begin. A boy. His name was Ryan." Emily froze, the color draining from her face. "A boy," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot glanced at her, then back at Samuel. "If I had to guess, this isn't just about erasing her identity. It's about separating her from this child. Whitman wanted them apart for a reason." Samuel felt his chest tighten, the pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. Ryan isn't just a name. He's her son. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Emily sank into the sofa, her hands trembling. I had a child," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. How could I forget something like that? Samuel sat beside her, his heart breaking for the pain in her voice. You didn't forget, Emily. They took it from you. They stole everything. Elliot cleared his throat, his expression somber. If this boy is still alive, we need to find him. But if Whitman is involved, you can bet he's being kept somewhere out of reach. Samuel looked at Emily, his resolve hardening. Then we'll reach him, whatever it takes. For the first time, Emily looked at him with something more than fear, hope. She nodded, wiping her tears. We have to find him. I won't let them take anything else from me. The three of them began to strategize, knowing they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. The stakes had risen, and the web of lies spun by Thomas Whitman was unraveling. But with every revelation, the danger grew, and Samuel knew that the battle ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Together, they prepared to confront a past that refused to stay buried and a future that depended on their courage. The tension in the safe house reached a fever pitch as the weight of the revelation settled over them. Samuel, Emily, and Elliot pored over the documents, each of them acutely aware that every moment spent digging into the past brought them closer to the wrath of Thomas Whitman. The truth about Ryan had ignited something in Emily, a fire that seemed to burn brighter with every passing minute. We can't waste time, Emily said, her voice firm despite the tremor that lingered in her hands. If he's out there, I need to find him. He's my son. Samuel nodded. Elliot, what do we know about the orphanage? Is it still operational? Elliot frowned, flipping through his notes. It's technically still open, but barely. It's run by a private entity now, which makes it harder to access records. If Whitman's involved, you can bet the files are buried under layers of bureaucracy. Then we dig, Samuel said decisively. If we can connect the dots, we might be able to figure out where Ryan is now. Emily paced the room, her mind racing. But what if he doesn't remember me? What if he doesn't want to know me? Samuel stood and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. We don't know how he'll react, but you have the right to find him. And he has the right to know the truth. Their plan took shape quickly. Elliot would gather more intel on the orphanage while Samuel and Emily prepared to visit the facility. Time was of the essence, and they knew that Whitman's reach was vast. The clock was ticking, and every second felt heavier than the last. The next morning, Samuel and Emily made their way to the orphanage, a decrepit building nestled in a forgotten corner of upstate New York. The sight of the crumbling facade made Emily's heart ache. She couldn't shake the image of her son living in such a place, his childhood stolen just as hers had been. Inside, they were greeted by a weary-looking administrator who seemed suspicious of their presence. Samuel, ever the master of persuasion, took the lead. We're looking into a family matter, he said, his tone calm but authoritative. A boy named Ryan who would have been here about 12 years ago. The administrator hesitated, her eyes narrowing. We don't give out information about former residents. Samuel pulled out a checkbook and began writing. Perhaps a donation to your facility would help refresh your memory. The administrator's expression softened as she eyed the substantial figure Samuel scribbled onto the check. I might be able to pull some old records, she said, disappearing into a back room. Minutes stretched into eternity before she returned, a dusty folder in hand. Ryan Foster, she said, handing it over. He left the orphanage 10 years ago. Adopted by a family in Albany. Emily clutched the folder to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. Do you have any more recent information? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The administrator shook her head. Once a child is adopted, we don't keep track of them. Privacy laws and all that. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Back in the car, Emily opened the folder with trembling hands. The file contained a single photo, a boy of about 7 with bright eyes and a shy smile. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart breaking and swelling with love all at once. That's him, she whispered. That's my son. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on hers. We'll find him, he said. This is just the beginning. The trip back to the city was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. Once they returned to the safe house, Elliot joined them with new information. I tracked down the family that adopted Ryan, he said, spreading out documents on the table. The Millers. Solid background, no red flags. They moved to Albany shortly after adopting him, but here's the twist. He ran away 5 years ago. No one's seen him since. Emily's knees buckled, and she sat down heavily. He ran away, she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. Why? Elliot shook his head. I couldn't find much on the circumstances, but I did track some sightings. He's been living in the city, Brooklyn, specifically. Last known location was a shelter near Red Hook. Emily's head spun. The thought of her son, now likely a young man, fending for himself in the streets was almost too much to bear. We have to go to him, she said, her voice trembling with urgency. We have to find him before Whitman does. Samuel agreed, but his mind was already racing ahead. If Whitman knows about Ryan, he'll try to keep us from reaching him. We need to stay one step ahead. The three of them set out that evening, making their way to the shelter. It was a modest building, crowded and chaotic, but the staff were kind and helpful. After a brief conversation, the shelter manager led them to a quiet corner where a young man sat hunched over a book. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Even though he was older now, she recognized him instantly. His dark hair, the curve of his jaw, this was her son. Ryan, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The young man looked up, his expression guarded. Who are you? He asked, his tone wary. Emily stepped closer, her voice trembling. I'm your mother, she said, and I've been looking for you. Ryan's eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing across his face. I don't have a mother, he said flatly, and I don't know who you are. Samuel stepped forward, his presence commanding but gentle. Ryan, we've uncovered a lot of things you deserve to know. Just give us a chance to explain. Ryan hesitated, his eyes darting between them. Finally, he sighed and motioned for them to sit. You've got 5 minutes, he said. Start talking. As Samuel and Emily recounted the story, the memory erasure, the adoption, and Whitman's machinations, Ryan's skepticism began to waver. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable, until they finished. I don't know if I believe you, he said finally, his voice tight. But if what you're saying is true, then why now? Why didn't you come for me sooner? Emily reached for his hand, her tears falling freely. I didn't know, she said. They took everything from me. My memories, my life. I only just found out about you. Please, Ryan, give me a chance to make it right. Ryan pulled his hand away, his jaw clenching. I don't need anyone to make it right. I've been on my own for a long time and I'm fine. Samuel spoke then, his voice steady but firm. You may not need us, Ryan, but Whitman isn't going to stop. He'll come after you, just like he came after her. You deserve the truth, and you deserve to be safe. Ryan stared at them for a long moment, the weight of their words sinking in. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained guarded. I'll listen, he said, but don't expect me to trust you. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As they left the shelter together, the shadows of Whitman's influence loomed larger than ever. The truth had brought them together, but it had also painted a target on their backs. They would need to move quickly, for the past was catching up, and Whitman would do whatever it took to keep his secrets buried. The tension in the air was palpable as Samuel, Emily, and Ryan sat around the table in the safe house. The weight of what they had uncovered pressed heavily on all of them. Ryan was quiet, his arms crossed as he leaned back in his chair, watching Samuel and Emily with a guarded expression. Trust didn't come easily to him, and Samuel understood that. He had lived through betrayal himself. He knew the walls it built. We can't stay here, Samuel said finally, breaking the silence. Whitman will have people looking for us. We need to keep moving, but first, we need to plan our next steps. Ryan raised an eyebrow. And what exactly are those steps? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you dragged me into something I didn't ask for. Emily flinched at his words, but Samuel kept his tone even. Ryan, this isn't just about us. It's about you too. Whitman didn't just erase Emily's identity. He separated you from her for a reason. That reason is tied to something bigger, something he's desperate to keep hidden. Ryan's skepticism didn't waver, but he gestured for Samuel to continue. What's the plan then? Samuel placed a folder on the table. Elliot found another lead. There's a property owned by Whitman just outside the city, a private estate. It's heavily secured, but it's where he conducts most of his private business. If we want answers, we'll find them there. Emily looked alarmed. You're talking about breaking into one of Whitman's properties? That's dangerous, Samuel. It's our only chance, Samuel said firmly. He's been pulling the strings for years, hiding the truth about you, about Ryan. If we don't act, he'll bury this deeper, and we'll never find the answers. Ryan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What happens if we get caught? Do you have any idea what someone like him could do to us? Samuel met his gaze without flinching. I've dealt with men like Whitman before. I know how they operate. That's why we need to be smart about this. Elliot entered the room then, carrying a laptop and a stack of maps. I scoped the place out, he said, setting the maps on the table. It's a fortress, security cameras, guards, the works. But there's a service tunnel that runs beneath the property. It hasn't been used in years, but it's still accessible. It's our best way in. Emily's hands trembled as she looked at the maps. I don't want to put Ryan in danger. Ryan scoffed. I've been taking care of myself for years. I'm not afraid of some rich guy's goons. Samuel smiled faintly. Good. Because this isn't just about survival. It's about ending this once and for all. Over the next several hours, they planned meticulously. Elliot provided blueprints and security details while Samuel outlined the timing and roles for each of them. Emily, despite her fears, insisted on being part of the operation. Ryan was reluctant at first, but as the plan took shape, his resolve hardened. If Whitman had stolen his past, then it was time to take it back. By the time night fell, they were ready. Dressed in dark clothing and armed with the tools Elliot had procured, they left the safe house, their determination outweighing their fear. The estate loomed in the distance as they approached, its high walls and floodlights casting long shadows. As they slipped into the service tunnel, the air grew colder, the weight of the confrontation ahead pressing down on them. Samuel led the way, his flashlight illuminating the narrow path. Behind him, Emily and Ryan moved quietly, their breaths shallow but steady. The tunnel emerged near the edge of the property, where the cover of darkness shielded them from the guards. Elliot's voice crackled through the earpiece Samuel wore. You're clear for now. Cameras are looped, but you'll need to move fast. They made their way toward the main building, their movements calculated and precise. Every step brought them closer to the truth and to the danger that awaited them. The estate's interior was as opulent as Samuel had expected. Marble floors, gilded fixtures, and a pervasive sense of power. But beneath the veneer of wealth lay an unmistakable tension, the kind that came from secrets too dangerous to reveal. Samuel's heart pounded as they moved through the hallways, their destination clear. Whitman's private office. Elliot's voice guided them through the earpiece. You're close. 2 guards stationed outside the office door. Take them out quietly. Samuel nodded to Ryan, who tightened his grip on the taser Elliot had provided. Together, they approached the guards, their movements synchronized. Within seconds, the guards were subdued, their unconscious bodies hidden in a nearby storage room. Emily's hands shook as Samuel picked the lock on the office door. What if he's in there? She whispered. Samuel didn't answer. The lock clicked, and the door swung open, revealing a room filled with shelves of documents, a massive oak desk, and a wall of monitors displaying live security footage. The room was empty, but its contents were more than enough to fuel their mission. Start looking, Samuel said, his voice firm but low. We need anything that ties Whitman to Oblivion or the orphanage. They moved quickly, sifting through files and drawers. Emily's breath caught as she found a folder labeled Project Oblivion. Inside were detailed reports about the memory erasure program, complete with signed directives from Thomas Whitman himself. Samuel, she said, her voice trembling as she handed him the folder. This proves everything. Samuel flipped through the pages, his anger rising with each damning piece of evidence. This isn't just about you, he said, his voice tight. Whitman's been using this program to silence people, to control them. This is bigger than we thought. Ryan, meanwhile, found a small safe hidden behind a painting. There's a safe here, he said, motioning for Samuel to come over. Samuel quickly set to work cracking the safe, his fingers moving deftly over the dial. When it clicked open, he pulled out a stack of documents and a small hard drive. One of the documents caught his attention immediately, a birth certificate with Ryan's name on it. The father's name was left blank, but the mother's was clear, Lauren Whitman. Ryan, Samuel said, holding up the birth certificate, this is proof of who you are. Ryan stared at the document, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. All these years, he said, his voice shaking. He knew. He knew who I was, and he kept me in the dark. The sound of footsteps outside the office made them freeze. Samuel motioned for silence as the door handle began to turn. They scrambled to hide, but before they could, the door opened, and Thomas Whitman himself stepped inside. Whitman froze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Well, he said, his voice cold and calculating. I didn't expect to see you here, Samuel. Or you, Lauren. Or should I say, Emily? Emily stepped forward, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. You stole my life, she said, her voice trembling with rage. You took my son. And now we're going to expose everything. Whitman's lips curled into a cruel smile. You have no idea what you're getting into, he said. But if you've come this far, you've left me no choice. He reached for the alarm, but Samuel lunged forward, grabbing his arm. The two men struggled as Ryan and Emily watched, frozen in shock. Finally, Samuel managed to pin Whitman against the desk, his voice low and dangerous. It's over, Whitman. You can't hide this anymore. Whitman sneered. You think you've won? You have no idea how deep this goes. But Samuel's resolve was unshaken. Maybe not, he said. But we're going to find out. The confrontation in Thomas Whitman's office had left Samuel, Emily, and Ryan on the brink of collapse. They stood over Whitman, his defiance unshaken despite being pinned to his desk. The tension was palpable, every second threatening to spiral into chaos. Samuel's grip on Whitman's arm tightened as his voice cut through the silence. You're going to answer for everything you've done, Samuel said, his tone cold and unwavering. The lies, the manipulation, the lives you destroyed. It all ends here. Whitman's laugh was low and mocking. You think you've won because you broke into my office and found a few files? You're amateurs. By the time you try to use any of this, it'll be too late. The world doesn't care about justice. It cares about power. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. You don't get to define what happens anymore. You took everything from me, my son, my identity, my life. But I'm taking it back. Whitman's expression flickered, a brief shadow of something. Regret, perhaps, but it was gone in an instant. Lauren, he said, using her real name for the first time, you don't understand. Everything I did to protect you. You were too naive to see the dangers around you. I saved you from yourself. Emily's hands clenched into fists, her anger overtaking her fear. You didn't save me, you controlled me. You destroyed my life and Ryan's, all for your own selfish agenda. That ends now. Before Whitman could respond, Ryan stepped forward, his presence commanding. You're nothing but a coward, he said, his voice steady and sharp. You hid behind money and power while people like me had to fight to survive. You don't get to decide what happens to us anymore. Whitman sneered, but his gaze lingered on Ryan, and for the first time, Samuel saw a flicker of uncertainty in the man's eyes. You think the truth will set you free? Whitman said, his voice dripping with disdain. The world doesn't care about the truth. Samuel leaned in, his voice low and deadly. Maybe not, but the right people will. With that, Samuel tied Whitman's hands behind his back, using a belt from one of the guards they had subdued earlier. We're taking you with us, he said. You're going to answer for everything. As they exited the estate, Elliot's voice crackled through the earpiece. You've got company, 2 SUVs heading your way. You need to move. Now. The group hurried toward the service tunnel, Whitman in tow. The sound of engines roaring in the distance spurred them on, adrenaline coursing through their veins. By the time they reached the car, the SUVs were in sight, their headlights piercing through the darkness. Drive, Samuel shouted as they piled into the vehicle. He floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as the SUVs gave chase. The night turned into a blur of flashing lights and screeching tires as Samuel weaved through the streets, determined to outrun their pursuers. Emily clutched Ryan's arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't let them catch us," she said, her voice frantic. "They won't," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the chaos. He took a sharp turn down a narrow alley, the SUVs struggling to follow. When they emerged onto a main road, Elliot's voice came through again. "Turn left ahead, there's a construction site. You can lose them there." Samuel followed Elliot's instructions, the car bouncing over uneven terrain as they sped through the site. The SUVs fell behind, their heavy frames ill-suited for the narrow paths. Finally, they emerged onto a quiet street, the sounds of pursuit fading into the distance. They drove in silence for several minutes, the tension slowly ebbing. When they reached a safe location, a nondescript warehouse owned by one of Elliot's contacts, Samuel parked the car and turned to the group. "We're not done yet," he said, "but we've bought ourselves some time." Inside the warehouse, Samuel and Elliot worked quickly to organize the evidence they had gathered. The documents, the hard drive, and Whitman's signed directives were enough to implicate him in a host of illegal activities, from the memory erasure program to financial fraud and beyond. Whitman sat tied to a chair, his expression a mix of anger and resignation. "You think you can bring me down?" he spat. "You're delusional." Samuel ignored him, focusing on the task at hand. Ryan, however, couldn't hold back. He stepped closer to Whitman, his fists clenched. "You ruined my life," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "But you don't get to win." Whitman's smile was cold. "I already have, boy. You're nothing without me." Ryan's anger boiled over, but Emily stepped between them, her voice calm but firm. "He's not worth it," she said. "We've already won." The next morning, they delivered the evidence to multiple outlets, law enforcement, journalists, and advocacy groups. Within hours, the story broke. Whitman's empire began to crumble under the weight of the revelations, his influence eroding as the world learned the truth about his crimes. For Samuel, Emily, and Ryan, the aftermath was bittersweet. The battle had taken its toll, but it had also brought them closer than they could have imagined. Emily and Ryan began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Samuel, too, found a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as the sun set over the city, the three of them sat together on the balcony of Samuel's penthouse. The air was quiet, the chaos of the past weeks finally giving way to a sense of calm. "Do you think it's really over?" Emily asked, her voice soft. Samuel looked out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "Not entirely," he said, "but we've done what we set out to do. The rest is up to us." Ryan leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. "I never thought I'd have this. A family." Emily reached over and took his hand, her own smile bittersweet. "Neither did I. But we've found each other, and that's what matters." As the night deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey lifting. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they would face it together. For the first time in years, hope felt like more than just a distant dream. It felt real. And as the city lights twinkled in the distance, Samuel allowed himself a rare smile. They had fought for the truth, for love, for redemption. And in the end, they had found what they had been searching for all along, a chance to begin again. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the story. I'm sure the next video appearing on your screen will also move you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. A big kiss and see you in the next story.